Hi, everybody. First of all, I want to thank Rachel again for her persistence because we had planned to do this talk a couple of years ago, and of course, COVID got in the way. So now that we've all discovered Zoom and we're able to come into each other's homes without actually touching each other, we're able to do this tonight via Zoom. I want to begin tonight's talk by dedicating this talk to all of the people who have lost their lives and the millions of displaced people from Ukraine. As I was preparing this talk tonight, I couldn't help but compare what's going on there with this story that I'm going to tell you about events that happened in Turkey and in Greece 100 years ago. And so let's sort of keep those people in the back of our minds tonight. Let me tell you quickly what I'm going to do tonight. First of all, I'm going to introduce you to two American women physicians, Dr. Esther Lovejoy and Dr. Ruth Parmelee. I want us to try to understand why American women doctors are overseas. I want to place their medical careers in the complex historical background of what's going on in that time. I'm sure that many of you don't know too much about World War I history or the history of the Armenian genocide or the Greco-Turkish hostilities. So I'm going to be sort of telling you parts of that story. I mean, this is a very big story, so I can't get into all of it, but I will do the best that I can. We'll look in some detail at Dr. Lovejoy's and Dr. Parmalee's work in the Near East and Greece in the first half of the 20th century, and try to analyze the purpose and vision that these women had along with their institutions, and then we'll have some open discussion. Now, I'm going to be introducing a lot of photographs during the talk, and I want you to really sort of pay attention to the photographic evidence that I'll be sharing here with you, because every one of those photographs were distributed widely in brochures, in newspaper articles, in medical journals, in women's journals, in all kinds of venues, even radio talks, to tell the American people about the catastrophic humanitarian crisis going on in Greece and Turkey at this time. And in order to gain monies to serve these folks in their time of need, they used some universal tropes in order to attract funds, and I'll get into that a little bit more. So just be thinking about the photographs as we're going through it. I'm going to start the talk with a very dramatic event that occurred in the city of Smyrna, today known as Izmir, on the west coast of Turkey. You can see here a photograph with a woman with an X over her head. That is Dr. Lovejoy, who happened to be a witness of the burning of Smyrna. This event is an event that would transform her organization, the American Women's Hospitals, from an organization that was pressing for women physicians to be included in wartime medicine, to a medical humanitarian organization that would reach around the world in Dr. Lovejoy's lifetime. American women physicians were not allowed to go and serve under the auspices of the United States government or the United States Army. Nurses, yes; doctors, no. So American women doctors, who were very well organized by the time that the war breaks out, sent over an emissary in the body of Dr. Lovejoy to see what the conditions were in France in particular. She came back, and a few months later, they had established the American Women's Hospitals in France, and would establish many, many more. The American Women's Hospitals really is a precursor to the organization that we know of today as the Doctors Without Borders. So just in case you didn't realize that it's American women who invented that whole idea of voluntary medical people going to the sites of, warfare, natural disasters, et cetera, et cetera. This is something that American women were part of establishing during the World War I period. Now, Smyrna was a place that was a very well-established trade city with very large numbers of Turkish residents, as well as Greek residents, Armenians, Jews. It was a very cosmopolitan city. And the burning of Smyrna, with about 30,000 people dying within a couple of days, was marked the close of 100 years of war between Greece and Turkey in the context of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of nationalisms in the region. This was a time when Turkey decided that Turkey was going to be Turkified. It was Turkey for Turks. And they had, wholesale campaigns to remove other ethnic groups, as a time of ethnic cleansing. And so we have, this is the place where the Armenian genocide takes place. And a few years later, a Greek genocide that was also pushing Greeks out of Turkey. The Greek army retreated from Turkey, where there had been battles going on, in September 1922. And a few days later, the Armenian and Greek neighborhoods in Smyrna were systematically burned, and Armenian and Greek residents were killed by the Turkish army, forced out of their homes and murdered on the streets. Lovejoy heard about what was going on in Smyrna and all this movement of civilians trying to get away from the army, trying to get away from the conflict. And she was in Geneva at the Medical Women's International Association, where they were talking about what to do further with the American women's hospitals. And now that the World War I was over, and she immediately went off to see what was going on in Smyrna. She reported to her colleagues of the conditions, calling for medical aid for the victims, and she gathered all kinds of information to share with the American public to raise money for the Greek and Armenian refugees, arguing that although World War I was over, there were many still in need of aid, and there were many American women, doctors and nurses who wanted to rush to help. Here's just a couple of samples of the kinds of publicity materials that they put out. A photograph of a woman with her children in very dire circumstances, headlines that would really catch the eye. And some of the quotes from one of the articles where Lovejoy says that most of the crowd were women and children, that there were many pregnant women, that over 100 women were in labor standing online to try to get on a ship to get away from Smyrna and giving birth. She was actually assisting many of these births. The deaths of some of the infants, and she also reported widespread rape. So she was really talking on behalf of women and children. A brief introduction to Ruth Parmelee. This is one of my favorite pictures of her. She's very young here. This is about 1916, and here she is with her horse. She began her missionary work in Turkey in 1914 on the eve of the First World War, and she's one of many missionaries who witnessed and reported about the Armenian genocide of 1915-1916. She also witnessed the conflicts with the Greeks who were in Turkey at the time, and wrote extensively about it, back to her missionary society, to her medical colleagues, to the general public, letting people know what was going on there. she wrote in the early 1920s, quote, "What is the civilized world going to do about the Turkish government's steady oppression of the Armenians and the deportation of so many of the Greeks?" So she, she was urging the United States government and other kinds of officials to do something to help the people, as she was watching people systematically killed. Were American women who went overseas during World War I and also for this time simply doing their bit, or were they seeking professional autonomy? Okay, so we have to think about push factors as well as pull factors. We know that there was a lot of work that needed to be done, and certainly many Americans wanted to show their patriotism by doing something toward the war effort. But also we have to think about the conditions under which American women physicians and nurses were working in the United States, and what their professional opportunities were and what some of the difficulties were that they faced. Well, certainly since the 19th century, the middle of the 19th century, when women first began to study medicine to become doctors, they faced a lot of discrimination. They had to invent all kinds of arguments to get into medical schools. And there was a big sort of separatist movement where there were women's medical education separate from men, segregated from men, women's hospitals, women's healthcare that was, segregated by sex. And in part that was because the men simply wouldn't let women into the medical schools. There were a few that got through, but most of the American women by the turn of the 20th century had come through an all women's medical network. And once they graduated, they had trouble getting positions in hospitals or even opening practices. Landlords wouldn't, allow women to rent space for offices because they didn't think that it was women's proper place. So they invented this kind of an ideology that historians call maternalist medicine. They said that only women can understand the problems, medical problems that other women have with reproduction, with all kinds of illnesses. Women don't want to go to men doctors. They don't want them examining them. They don't think that men doctors are going to understand them. So they carved out a space for themselves in medicine to be specialists in the care of women and children. And that's certainly the kind of ideology that they were using in order to justify their place in serving as medical, serving, in war medicine and other forms of medical aid, saying, look, there are women and children that need us out there, and that's why we're here. They were also building upon a tradition to so-called, quote, save the Near East Christian populations. I know that many of you remember hearing when you were a small child that we needed to send money to, so quote, save the starving Armenians. And this became, a kind of call to the help of Christian minorities in other parts of the world, and in particular in Turkey. Many American missionaries served in various Near Eastern locations since the 19th century, and they were witnesses to the hostility and violence between Turks and the Christian minorities in Greece and Turkey. And they promoted a kind of image of these Christians as being martyrs, as opposed to the way that they described the Islamic Turks as uncivilized Mohammedans. So there's a bit of racism that's going on here. with the way this story is covered. And, you know, I have to admit that the American women's hospitals, the missionaries spent most of their time addressing the needs of the Christian minorities and not so much other people who were in their midst. The American response to the 1915 Armenian genocide began with the initial reports to President Wilson from his ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau, who described Turkey as a place of horror. And the West eventually began to take notice, you know, putting newspaper articles out, the stories about the slow massacre of the race, public outrage over this tragedy led to unprecedented philanthropic crusade, an international philanthropic crusade to address the humanitarian concerns. Okay. Well, I have a lot more information there, but I'll save that for the question and answer period. Like I said, this is a big story. I'm trying to do it justice, but I will leave some of the detail aside for now. Let me tell you about a more full background of Esther Clayson-Pohl, Lovejoy, and Dr. Parmalee in the next few slides. These women lived very long lives. Esther Lovejoy from 1869 to 1967. And when I tell you this was a productive life, I'm not exaggerating at all, because from what I heard after meeting with and interviewing her secretary of many, many years, who was still alive in the 90s and early 2000s when I was doing this work, Dr. Lovejoy was in the office up until just days before her death. I mean, she was well into her 90s and she was still working for the American women's hospitals. She was born in 1869 in Oregon in a lumber camp. Her parents were from England, and her father tried several kinds of businesses, but he was kind of a ne'er-do-well. He really didn't succeed very much in business, and they ended up in Portland, Oregon by 1883, opening a hotel where she and her mother really sort of took care of this business. The father wasn't around that much. And her mother suffered with health problems stemming from numerous pregnancies. And as a daughter and one of the older children, she was really sort of always there to help her mother. She was inspired by the woman doctor who helped deliver her youngest sibling to become a doctor herself. And by the 1890s, she was the second woman to graduate from the University of Oregon Medical School in 1894. She married a classmate, Emil Pohl, the following year. And they were very adventurous, you know, pioneer types. They went to Alaska for the gold rush. And story tells, I read in one source that their practice, she was the first woman doctor in the Klondike, and that their practice was, he was sort of taking care of the miners and she was taking care of the prostitutes. You know what these mining towns are like. And certainly they were up there. I have some pictures of them up there in the next slide, but this is a picture of, you can see Dr. Lovejoy with her son. Unfortunately, he only lived till 7 years of age. He died of an infectious disease. And just probably a year or so after this photograph was taken. And her husband also died of encephalitis, another infectious disease. He was still in Alaska. She was in Portland at this time, taking care of her child and her mother. She certainly was a very devoted family person, but by the time she married again after her husband died and divorced, and by the time She, you know, of the World War I period, and certainly by 1920, she was divorced and able to really devote her entire life to service. Here's just a couple of more pictures of Dr. Lovejoy with her, with some of her colleagues during World War I. The uniform, you see the women wearing, you know, paramedical or medical type uniforms, even though they're not in the Army. They're not allowed to be serving in any official capacity other than doing their own thing, building their own institutions. And you can see there too, also 2 pictures of her with her husband in Alaska. She was the first woman to head a health department in a major city in the United States, in Portland, 1905 to 1909. There are stories about her placement of nurses in all of the schools so that kids could get medical care, take, you know, exams and so forth. She also is credited with preventing not even a single case of bubonic plague on the West Coast in this time period. There were several cities, San Francisco, Seattle, and many other cities that had terrible rat, you know, a rat problem, which led to bubonic plague. And she just put out some kind of rat killing campaign. There wasn't a single case. She's very well known for that. And I think that that experience also helped her in her later years when she would be helping people in, you know, in a public health way in these disastrous situations. She really had community medicine in her pocket. She did that international work in World War I. She was founder of the American Women's Hospitals. And like I said before, she led the American Women's Hospitals until 1967. Dr. Ruth Parmelee is also, you know, lived a very long and productive life. She's a little younger than Dr. Lovejoy. She was born in 1885 in Turkey of missionary parents. Her father was a physician. Her mother was a teacher. There's a lot to this story, but I'm just sort of kind of compress it for you. She's the last of several surviving children and the only one to follow her parents' footsteps into missionary work, embodying in some ways her father. She becomes a physician herself, and her mother, her devotion to teaching. She was very involved in nurses training in particular throughout her career. She left Turkey in the mid 1890s. There were some, I'm going to use the word pogroms going on against the some of the Armenians in 1895-96 in her community, and her parents felt, let's get the kids out of here. So the 3 youngest, Ruth and her 2 brothers, Maurice and Julius, are sent to Oberlin, Ohio, where there's a very active missionary community of people who are helping, you know, while parents are off in foreign places all over the world, children coming back, people there providing homes for the children, education. And Oberlin, at Oberlin, she finished high school and she also finished college. After her high school graduation, she went to Turkey where her parents were to visit with them. Her father was very ill at the time, and he died in 1902. So Ruth and her mother returned back to the United States. She goes to medical school, graduates in 1912, finishes her internship and begins her medical work in Turkey, always wanting to return. And her mother as well, she takes her mother with her. Her mother dies the following year. By 1917, so she's there for 3 years. By 1917, when the United States enters the war, all Americans have to leave Turkey. Turkey is on the German side of World War I, just to remind you. So all of the Americans have to leave. She comes back to the United States, continues telling people about what she saw there and what's going on there, by going on lecture tours, publishing a lot of newspaper articles and other kinds of articles in missionary magazines and medical and so forth. After the war, she goes back with many Americans, not just missionaries, but other kinds of volunteers to assist with the post-war work. And it's at that time that she begins to see the Turkish government going against the Greeks who are in Turkey. And so she witnesses another forced migration and genocide of the Greeks. She flees to Greece, and along with 1.5 million refugees, sets up medical institutions there with in cooperation with American Women's Hospitals and the Greek government, first in Salonika, then in Athens. And she worked in Greece until her retirement in the 1950s, after serving the Greeks and Armenians in Greece and Turkey for over 40 years. And she's not well known in the history of medicine circles, I think, because she was out of the country so much compared to Dr. Lovejoy, who's very well known because of her establishment of this sort of international women's health work. How do we know about the work of Dr. Lovejoy? I just want to spend a minute just telling you that these women left records for us. My work is based on primary and secondary sources from 3 types of organization: Christian missionary organization, more specifically the records of the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions, secular humanitarian organizations such as the Near East Relief, which is founded at the end of World War I and is specifically, it's a sort of a combination of missionaries and secular folks who are going to work on the humanitarian relief, and the American Women's Hospitals, which is a huge collection that's down in Philadelphia. They also left memoirs, photographs, diaries, correspondence, newspaper articles, brochures. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of documents to go through, both photographic and written documents. And I want to really thank the descendants of Dr. Parmalee for sharing many materials with me, and some of the colleagues of Dr. Lovejoy who also shared things with me, things that were not in the archives. You know, somehow word gets out when you're working on somebody and people contact you. It's really wonderful. This is an example, Certain Samaritans, of only one of several books that Lovejoy wrote. And I couldn't tell you, there's hundreds and hundreds of articles. Okay, so a little more detail about Dr. Parmalee's first appointment in Harput, Turkey, 1914 to 1917. Because I want to explain that the role of women in missionary work changed during the 2 generations in which Ruth and her mother Julia lived and worked in Turkey. In the early years of missionary presence in the Near East, wives were expected to be helpmates to their husbands, who were the ministers. But by the end of the 19th century, missionary wives and many, many single women traveled to foreign lands and played a much more public role by involving themselves in the schools and the orphanages and in other kinds of missionary institutions, including hospitals and nursing schools. This is as a result of many educational reforms that were designed to educate girls and boys in secular schools in Turkey. Many new schools were established, and these schools needed teachers. So there were hundreds and hundreds of educated women who were recruited from America to serve. This is a place where the first and second generation of college educated women in American history could find a place for themselves to work and to thrive. When Dr. Parmalee arrived in 1914, she was assigned a position in Harput, which is located in the hinterlands of eastern Turkey. This is where she went on these calls on horseback in these very frontier conditions, taking her black bag, scrambling around for medical materials and so forth. She was one of 5 American missionaries in Eastern Turkey and the only woman. And the conditions of the war, again, remember, she got there in 1914, and the forthcoming refugee situation gave her, she was immediately pressed into, a very, very busy work schedule. She kept records, and as I was reading through these records, I just could not get over the number of people that they were seeing to try to take care of them medically. Ruth can be credited with introducing modern nursing education in Turkey. And as you can see here, if you read through my notes, the numbers of the growth of the missionary movement in the schools in Turkey at the time. After the war was over and she returned to Turkey with a group from Oberlin, you can see here a photograph. I think she's in the front center. No, excuse me. First row in the front left is Ruth, and so she went with some of the missionary friends, but also a lot of sort of civilians, and she was not that happy with them, I must say. She said that she didn't think that they were really serious enough. She called them she described them as not consecrated, not serious enough to sustain the work. She was a little critical of them. And here's another picture of them. And you can see, if you read my notes on the left, you can see the various types of people who were there to provide this help. And the huge number of patients that they were seeing in a period of less than 2 weeks, 1,150 cases in the dispensary of 387. So this means like people went 2 or 3 times to the dispensary for care in less than 2 weeks. Now, I'm going to start to show you now some more pictures that include Ruth and some of her nurses pushing that idea of, the place of women in medicine is to take care of other women and children. And so here, and this is Ruth's handwriting on the back of this photograph, where she says she's holding 2.5 pairs of twins. The first twin of one mother was born on the way to the hospital. So a lot of these pictures and her quotes are seen in a missionary magazines, medical magazines, in newspaper articles all over the place, trying to depict American women doctors as child savers, echoing that identity that was acceptable. We're here to take care of other women and children. I'm going to show you some more pictures like this. She writes about witnessing the Greek genocide, in which you see hundreds and thousands of people being put on away from their home on forced marches from one place to another. She says that Dr. Ward, somebody that she was working with, says that they estimated that 30,000 people were sent down to Harput from Sivas, which is an even more remote area, and that probably 12,000 of those who had started out of the 30,000 were just died on the way. 11,000 who did arrive were pushed out and sent to a place toward Bitlis, which never heard from again. So this is sort of like the Turkish version of what we know of as the Trail of Tears here in the United States, the way Native Americans were treated in the 19th century. Um, in the narrative, the doctors would write up, you know, stories about the sanctity of the family being torn apart. Dr. Parmalee wrote, quote, "Men were systematically separated from women and children by Turkish soldiers. The men, for the most part, were taken to the interior and placed in labor gangs." Excuse me, this is not Dr. Parmalee. I'm sorry, that's Dr. Lovejoy. Panic-stricken children threw their arms about the legs of their fathers and shrieked for mercy, while wives clung to their husbands in a last despairing embrace. Some sons and husbands escaped if they were strong enough to swim to the Greek ships in the harbor, and they would avoid being shot by the Turkish soldiers. So this is, you know, I mean, we're hearing so many stories like this today about Ukraine, about the fact that the refugees are largely women, old folks, and younger women and children, with the men staying behind to fight the war. And we know this time many young women are fighting the war as well. But, you know, this whole idea of the separation of the parents from their children and husbands and wives from each other is certainly utilized at this time. Here's a sampling of Dr. Lovejoy's descriptions of the Smyrna disaster and this island, this nearby the Greek mainland called Makronisi, which was set up as a quarantine station. Quote, "At night, at Smyrna," she says, "at night, under the cover of darkness, Turkish soldiers raped the Greek women, and if the women survived to board a ship for Greece, they faced many unknowns, including permanent separation from loved ones, etc." And on the quarantine island itself, she says, "there are rows upon rows of shallow graves which are buried the victims of typhus and other diseases, and throughout the length and breadth of Greece there are thousands of refugees who are alive and well today as a result of this self-sacrificing, heroic effort on the part of this organization." It was the American Women's Hospital's personnel who were providing all of the medical aid in this situation. And note this picture here, you see, and it's the statement underneath, "bereft of husbands and sons and driven from home." So you see the older grandmother with a child sleeping on her lap, the younger mother with another child with their few belongings, and how, you know, how difficult this must be for these women who have to face a future where they don't have fathers, husbands, sons there to help support the family. Here are some more pictures of Makronisi, where American physicians and nurses deloused and vaccinated 22,000 people, preventing the spread of smallpox and typhus. And you can see here on the right, the woman with almost all of her belongings in that trunk. Another picture depicting American women caring for babies. The nurse that's there holding the baby, and Dr. Parmalee standing above her in her whites. And this is one of my favorite photographs because I think it really tells the story. It shows, you notice the Christian iconography, the Madonna and child, or the mother and child, but also Dr. Parmalee is there in her white coat, representing, you know, secular scientific woman doctor, and yet she has the empathy, the empathetic posture to you know, to show how much she cares about the woman and child. Another picture here of an Armenian refugee that Parmalee had trained in Turkey, and they found each other again in Salonika. And again, here's the nurse overseeing the care of all these newborn babies. Parmalee said in 1922 that she found the city teeming with newly landed refugees, that every building was crowded. By the way, the American Red Cross did help initially, but they were only there for about 6 months. So it was, truly the American women's hospitals, doctors and nurses did the majority of the medical relief in Greece during that first 10 years. By the end of 1922, Parmalee reports that nearly 140,000 refugees settled in and around Salonika, and they were the ones taking care of everybody. Here's a picture taken around probably around 1930 or so, a few years later, where showing Dr. Parmalee's persistence as a nurse educator. She started initially training nurses in Turkey, then in Salonika. And when she was transferred to Athens, she started another nursing school there. One of the women in the front row is a nurse, German-American nurse named Emily Wilms, who joined her in 1927 and worked with her for the next almost 20 years in training nurses and pushing forward public health work that was so important at that time, nursing going out into the community, immunizing people, teaching about hygiene, caring for wounds, et cetera, et cetera. I have a little story about Nurse Wilms, but I won't tell it now because I want us to have time to talk. Maybe we can get back to it later, but I just wanted to show you a little close-up picture of her with a baby and a child, again, showing that the work of these women is with women and children. These two pictures are, the one on the right shows one of the initial camps before housing was built for the refugees in Greece. Now, remind you, let me just mention that the total population of Greece in 1922 was about 4 million, and here they were absorbing 1.5 million more people, refugees, in a country where coffers were empty after 100 years of war with the Turks, because the independence war started in the 1820s. So Greece was really a very poor country, and here trying to absorb in 1.5 million people, it certainly wasn't easy. The picture on the left is built community for the refugees in a section of Piraeus called Kokkinia. And I can tell you that the refugees lived here for decades and decades and decades. And there's a lot of stories about Kokkinia and the refugee community, but can't get into that tonight. Just a few more, just a quick sort of picture of the many kinds of organizations that Parmalee was involved with here between 1935 and 1941, a long list. During the German occupation, she was forced to leave Greece, but was quickly asked to run a refugee camp in near Gaza, where she and Nurse Emily took care of about 10,000 Greek exiles fleeing from the Germans. More work after the war included continuing education of various kinds. By the way, the American women's hospitals opened, just look at the numbers, 26 independent hospitals, 14 orphanage infirmaries, 121 independent clinics and dispensaries. I mean, this was the American Women's Hospital's largest project. They just accomplished so much. So how do we judge these women? When I started working in the history of medicine, I told myself that I was going to follow the rule that we were following at the time, and that was not to tell just heroic stories of doctors. This doctor invented this, that doctor invented that, and to get away from what we called great men history. That is to say, to include women and to include patients, and to give much more historical background rather than just a single person who accomplished many things. And certainly this is a heroic story. I couldn't help but think of these women as heroic, but it's a very complicated heroic story. Dr. Lovejoy used her position to study and attack the effects of war on women. It was kind of a feminist spin in her criticism of the kinds of crises that these people had to face, and blamed men for being violent. Dr. Parmalee's establishment of modern nursing in Greece is extremely important. They both were really, really good at letting people know what the work was all about, what they were doing, and what was needed in many, many ways. They promoted that idea of maternalist medicine, that women need to be there to take care of women and children. They combined Christian imagery or language using the tropes of the missionaries in their stories of motherhood and childhood and the sanctity of the family so that they could raise money. What did I do? I went the wrong way. And it worked. Did maternalism work? It certainly did. Lovejoy raised more than $2 million in 1924 alone. She really put it out there. There were a lot of women who were very anti-war, and she addressed the ideas and issues of that group as well. She said, you know, only women could understand the plight of other women in desperate straits. Only women could understand the sanctity of the family and the need to protect children. So as a final conclusions, American women's record in saving or improving the lives of Armenians and Greeks is exceptional. Both of them, both Lovejoy and Parmalee, engaged in publicizing the flight of the refugees. They both emphasized the plight of women and children. They were both interested in elevating the position of women in medicine by providing opportunities for local women to receive medical and nursing training. They were instrumental in the public health movement in Greece. They both devoted their entire lives to service. Dr. Lovejoy from her office in the United States, and Dr. Parmalee working on the ground. So Dr. Parmalee was like the working arm of Dr. Lovejoy's programs. By working abroad, they accomplished their patriotic duty, helped people in need, and achieved a level of professional autonomy that never could have been accomplished in the United States. Just a little bit of recognition. Up in Pierce College, there's an infirmary named after Ruth Parmelee. There's a wing in an Athens hospital today named after Dr. Lovejoy. The Greek government honored both Lovejoy and Parmalee with medals of honor for this humanitarian work. On the upper right is a photo of the commander of the Royal Order of Beneficence awarded to Ruth Parmelee, and I want to thank Clint Walker, who's here tonight, Ruth's nephew, for sending it to me so I could hold it in my hands. And we just made arrangements to have it put in the archives of the Hoover Institution out in California. And the photograph on the lower right shows Dr. Lovejoy's many awards as well. Thank you.